Fans of the popular show Vikings will no doubt know of Rollo, the man who betrayed his own kind after reaching the breaking point of having lived in the shadow of his brother, Ragnar Lothbrok, as well as festering jealousy for his brother's relationship with the shield maiden Lagertha, who he is portrayed as having feelings for. In the show, Rollo is led to step out of the shadow of his brother and seize the kingdom of France for himself, which he then uses against his own people to quell Ragnar and his fellow Vikings. That's what the TV show will have you believe anyway. But unfortunately, not much of this is actually true, according to historical accounts. First of all, Rollo is said to have been born in 860 AD, while Ragnar was said to have been born in 740 AD. So you see, there's over 100 years between the two, and therefore, neither one of them could have likely existed at the same time, let alone be brothers. For those of you wondering, Rollo would not even be likely known as Rollo Lothbrok, because Lothbrok was a title given to Ragnar, meaning hairy breeches, so as to resemble the hairy breeches he supposedly possessed. Instead, we know Rollo as simply Rollo, or sometimes, as the saga suggests, Gandrolf, a name which meant the Walker. The idea stems from the belief that Rollo was so physically imposing that he was not able to mount a horse without it crumbling beneath him. Therefore, he was forced to walk wherever he went. In all the accounts from all the sagas we have, including Ragnar's own saga, Rollo is never actually mentioned. Considering what a significant part he plays in Ragnar's life in the TV show, I think this is something that would have certainly been mentioned in the sagas if any of it had actually happened. Furthermore, the entire raid on Paris that is depicted quite heavily on the TV show was said to actually be conducted entirely by Rollo, according to historical documentation, and incidentally, there is no mention of Ragnar at all, likely because, as I said earlier, the two existed at two very different periods of time. That is to say, if Ragnar Lothbrok actually existed at all. We can't 100% prove his existence, but at least we can prove Rollo's. The raids on Normandy are likely to have been the earliest account of Rollo's activity, something that the show credits Ragnar for doing, but before that, little about Rollo is actually known. A 10th century cleric by the name Dudo of St. Quentin wrote a biography about Rollo and noted that Rollo hailed from Denmark, and that the king at the time didn't like him or his family. When Rollo's father died, the king had Rollo's brother killed, and this forced Rollo to flee to Denmark for fear that he would be killed next. Meanwhile, an 11th century monk by the name Goffredo Malaterra argued that Rollo sailed from Norway and not Denmark. We understand that Rollo became the first ruler of Normandy, or at least a duke, who held significant authority. From what's understood, Rollo and his Vikings first gained a foothold in France in the valley of the lower river of Seine around the year 910, from which they approached the town of Rouen on their way to the grand prize of Paris, which they intended to take for themselves. But Rollo stopped at Rouen first, from which the townspeople likely gawked in horror at the approaching ships full of these savage, hulking Vikings. Sure enough, they'd likely have heard rumours of Viking attacks in neighbouring areas, but the tales could not prepare them for the sense of impending doom. The leaders of the town were said not to panic though, for they'd heard that Rollo was an honourable man, if not one who could be negotiated with. With this in mind, they daringly opened the gates, allowing for Rollo and his men to enter unhindered. This would pay off for the townsfolk, for while Rollo did take the settlements, he was said not to harm anyone in the process. Of course, this takeover would not go unnoticed by Paris, who began to anticipate the Vikings coming for them next. They could see the Viking fleet out on the waters, and in an attempt to protect themselves from the approaching ships, they built two massive walls to fortify the city. When the Vikings did eventually land and tried to scale the wall, the French soldiers shot them with arrows, and even poured barrels of burning oil down upon them. It seems that Rollo and his Vikings had underestimated the fortitude of Paris, so instead, he changed tactics and committed to a 13-month siege on the entire city. In order to draw some reaction from Paris, Rollo began to sail up and down the Seine River, pillaging the coastal lands. The king of West Francia, Charles the Simple, was forced to make a move and so requested a meeting with Rollo to try and work out some sort of arrangement. They would meet on opposite ends of the Seine River, flanked by their men, and would send messages back and forth, whilst likely staring each other out. But Charles the Simple wouldn't last too long in this staring contest. Bear in mind that he had already tried to repel Rollo's Northmen, but they had proved to be too fearsome, savage, and unlike anything the French soldiers had ever come across. There was a growing concern of the wild Northmen in the streets and amongst the aristocracy of the kingdom. Without a solid victory, fears of the Vikings only grew. Charles the Simple had managed to deliver a blow to Rollo's army, but he did not wish to risk the further spilling of blood when and if the Vikings regrouped, for they would no doubt come back hungrier. So he sought to set up a peace treaty with Rollo, which would grant him land between the Seine River. The peace treaty between Rollo and Charles the Simple of Normandy would be sealed by Rollo marrying Charles's daughter, Gisela. Rollo would agree to her baptizing and would even take the Christian name Robert. There have been some debates as to whether Gisela was actually a legitimate daughter of Charles the Simple, but for the most part this has been generally agreed upon. One large difference between the show and the actual history is that Gisela was not the beautiful woman who is portrayed here, but instead a young girl, as young as 5 years old in fact. Furthermore, the peace treaty also declared that Rollo would protect Charles the Simple and the French kingdom from the other Viking invasions, thus leading to the plot device from the show that Rollo turns against his own people. Rollo would later marry the daughter of Count Rennes, a woman named Poppa. Together, they would have a son named William, who would succeed Rollo after his death. By the year 918, Rollo's influence had grown so much that he began to outrightly rule Normandy after Charles the Simple granted him the land. 5 years later, in the year 923, Charles the Simple was overthrown after a revolt, and he would be succeeded by Robert of Neustria. But Robert of Neustria's reign was pretty short and lasted less than a year, for you see, he had forgotten about Rollo. Robert's rule was contested by Rollo, who may have still been honouring his treaty to Charles the Simple. Robert was killed in an ensuing battle by the combined efforts of Charles's Frank army and Rollo's Vikings. Robert would be succeeded by Rudolf of France, but he would want nothing of the war with the Vikings. Now increasingly more aware of the Viking threat, he conceded even more land to Rollo in the hopes of appeasing him and keeping on his good side. It seems that Rollo would live into his 90s, and when he died, he would leave his son William to become the Duke of Normandy, who would become a powerful influence through West Francia. An interesting side note is that Rollo is actually the great-great-great-grandfather of William the Conqueror, who would eventually take over England and start the lineage that would lead to the royals of today. In a sense, this technically makes Rollo a direct ancestor of the British royal family, as well as many other great European monarchs. Let me know what you thought about today's video about Rollo, and let me know in the comments of any differences between real life and the show that I might have missed, as well as your favourite Rollo moments from the TV show.
J'avoue, salut.
Until the next time, guys.